The moment someone starts treating your attention like a privilege they can grant or withdraw whenever they want, the relationship has already changed, even if you are the last person to realize it. I learned that on a quiet Tuesday evening in October. My name is Grant Walker. I was 49 years old, married for 19 years, and standing in my own living room holding 2 mugs of coffee when my wife said something that would quietly divide my life into a before and an after. Rachel was sitting on the couch with her phone in one hand, barely paying attention to the television glowing softly across the room. Rain tapped against the windows. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It should have been an ordinary evening. Instead, it became the night everything shifted. I handed her one of the mugs and sat down across from her. Before I could say anything, she looked up and spoke in a calm voice that sounded almost rehearsed. "From now on, I will decide when we talk or spend time together. And honestly, Grant, you need to stop chasing me." At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. Not because the words were unclear, because they were so unexpected. I stared at her for a second, waiting for some explanation that never came. Rachel took a sip of coffee and looked back down at her phone as if she had merely commented on the weather. Looking back, that detail stayed with me more than the words themselves. There was no anger, no argument, no emotional explosion, just complete certainty. What I did not realize in that moment was how much that certainty would force me to question everything about our marriage. For years, I had been the one reaching out, planning dinners, suggesting weekend trips, starting conversations, sending texts during the day, asking how she felt, asking what she needed. At the time, I viewed those things as acts of love. Maybe they were. But sitting there in that living room, I suddenly wondered if they had become something else, something expected, something taken for granted. The room felt unusually quiet. The grandfather clock near the dining room ticked steadily in the background. Outside, headlights reflected across wet pavement as cars moved through our neighborhood. Rachel continued scrolling through her phone. Meanwhile, my mind replayed her words again and again. "Stop chasing me." The strange thing was that part of me wanted to defend myself, to remind her of every effort I had made over the years, every sacrifice, every compromise, every moment I had chosen us over myself. But another part of me felt exhausted. Exhausted in a way I could not fully explain. Maybe because deep down I knew she was not describing a single conversation. She was describing a pattern that had existed for much longer than either of us wanted to admit. I carried my coffee into the kitchen a few minutes later and stood by the window watching rain slide down the glass. The reflection staring back at me looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Somewhere along the way, I had become a man constantly trying to maintain a connection that seemed to require more and more effort from only one side. That realization unsettled me, but it also raised a question I could not ignore. What would happen if I actually listened to her? What would happen if I stopped initiating every conversation, stopped making every plan, stopped carrying responsibility for every emotional bridge between us? The answer scared me because I genuinely did not know. For 19 years, my role had been simple. I was the one who reached, the one who fixed, the one who tried. Yet standing there in the dim kitchen light, while rain fell outside and the house settled into silence around me, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not resentment. Something quieter, something stronger. Acceptance. If Rachel wanted me to stop chasing her, then for the first time since the day we met, I was going to do exactly that. And what happened after that decision would reveal more about our marriage than anything that came before it. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray October sky that seemed determined to keep the sun hidden. I woke up before my alarm, not because I was well rested, but because my mind had spent most of the night replaying the conversation in the living room. For a few seconds, lying there in the quiet darkness, I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe Rachel had simply chosen the wrong words. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she had not meant it the way it sounded. But I was wrong. Deep down, I knew exactly what she meant. The uncomfortable truth was that her words only gave a voice to something that had been happening for years. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. School buses moved through the streets. Porch lights clicked off one by one. A light breeze pushed yellow leaves across driveways. Normally, sometime during the morning, I would send Rachel a message. Something simple. "Hope your meeting goes well. Have a great day. Let me know if you want to grab dinner tonight." Small gestures that had become part of my routine. That morning, I picked up my phone, stared at the screen, and then set it back down. What I did not realize at the time was how difficult that simple decision would be. Habits built over 19 years do not disappear overnight. Throughout the morning, I found myself reaching for my phone several times without thinking. Each time I stopped, not because I wanted to punish Rachel, not because I was trying to prove a point, because for the first time, I wanted to see what happened if I stopped doing all the work. Looking back, that was the beginning of something much bigger than I understood. Around noon, I sat alone in my truck during lunch and found myself thinking about the early years of our marriage. We had not started with much. Our first apartment had stained carpet, outdated appliances, and a parking lot that flooded whenever it rained hard. Yet those years felt different. Rachel used to call me during the day just to talk. We used to spend entire evenings planning trips we could not afford yet. We used to laugh at things that would not even seem funny now. Somewhere along the way, responsibility replaced spontaneity. Then routine replaced effort. Then comfort replaced appreciation. At least that was how it looked in hindsight. The rest of the workday passed quietly. When I arrived home that evening, Rachel was already there. She sat at the kitchen island looking through something on her tablet. Normally, I would have walked over immediately and started a conversation. Instead, I nodded politely and headed upstairs to change clothes. The interaction lasted maybe 3 seconds. Yet I noticed something unusual. Rachel looked up. Not for long. Just long enough to follow me with her eyes as I walked away. That detail stayed with me. Later that evening, I sat in the den reviewing some paperwork while rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt unusually calm. No tension, no arguments, no emotional discussions, just silence. The kind of silence that reveals things people normally keep hidden beneath conversation. Around 8 o'clock, Rachel appeared in the doorway. "How was work?" she asked. I looked up from the papers. For a moment, I almost smiled. The question itself was completely ordinary. What made it remarkable was that she had asked it. "Busy," I said. "Nothing too exciting." She nodded. "That is good." Then she stood there for a second as though expecting the conversation to continue on its own. Normally, I would have taken responsibility for that. I would have asked questions, filled the gaps, kept things moving. This time, I simply returned my attention to the paperwork. A few seconds later, she walked away. The moment lasted less than 30 seconds, but it revealed something important. The silence was no longer one-sided. That night, after Rachel went upstairs, I remained in the den listening to the rain. The lamp beside my chair cast a warm circle of light across the room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Vacation pictures. Holiday gatherings. 19 years of memories captured in frames. Looking at them, I realized something I had avoided admitting for a very long time. I had spent years measuring the strength of our marriage by how much effort I was willing to give. If things felt distant, I tried harder. If conversations became shorter, I reached further. If connection weakened, I doubled my efforts. But sitting there alone while the rain continued falling outside, another possibility entered my mind. What if a healthy relationship was never supposed to depend on one person carrying the entire weight? And for the first time since Rachel told me to stop chasing her, I found myself genuinely curious about where that question might lead. Looking back, the hardest truths were never hidden. They were sitting in plain sight the entire time, buried beneath routines I had stopped questioning. During the weeks that followed, I found myself noticing memories I had ignored for years. Not major events, not dramatic moments. Small things, ordinary things. The kind of moments that seem meaningless by themselves but become impossible to ignore when viewed together. One memory returned while I was driving home from work on a cloudy Thursday afternoon. About 2 years earlier, I had planned a weekend trip for Rachel and me. Nothing extravagant, just a cabin rental a couple of hours away where we could disconnect for a few days. I remembered spending weeks researching locations, reading reviews, and arranging my work schedule. The night before we were supposed to leave, Rachel told me she was not really in the mood anymore. She suggested postponing it. The trip never happened. At the time, I convinced myself it was not important. But I was wrong. The issue was never the trip itself. The issue was how quickly I accepted disappointment whenever it came from her. Another memory surfaced a few days later. I was standing in the grocery store looking at coffee brands when I remembered a Saturday morning several years earlier. Rachel had spent nearly an hour talking on the phone with a friend while I sat nearby waiting for us to leave for a local festival we had planned to attend. Eventually, she decided she was too tired to go. I remember smiling and saying it was fine. Then I spent the afternoon mowing the lawn instead. Looking back, what surprised me was not her decision. It was how automatically I adjusted my expectations. Again and again, I reshaped my plans around her priorities. At some point, it became normal. What I did not realize was that normal and healthy were not always the same thing. As October moved toward November, these memories kept appearing. A canceled dinner reservation. A movie night interrupted by endless scrolling on a phone. Conversations that ended before they really began. Small moments. Small disappointments. Yet together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. One evening after work, I came home and found Rachel sitting at the kitchen island. The television played quietly in the next room. Outside, a cold wind pushed fallen leaves across the backyard. I grabbed a bottle of water and headed toward the den. "Grant," she called. I stopped and turned around. "Yeah." She hesitated for a second. "How was your day?" The question seemed simple, yet something about it felt different. There was actual curiosity behind it. Not obligation. Curiosity. "It was good," I said. "Busy, but productive." She nodded slowly. Normally, I would have followed that exchange with several questions of my own. This time I simply waited. After a few seconds, she looked almost surprised that the conversation had ended. The moment lasted less than half a minute, but it stayed with me for the rest of the night. What happened next surprised me even more. The less I chased interaction, the more aware I became of who was actually initiating it. For years, I had been so focused on creating connection that I rarely stopped to examine where it originated. Now I could see the difference clearly. The silence revealed everything. A week later, I found myself sitting alone on the back patio just before sunset. The air was cool. The trees beyond our fence glowed orange and gold beneath the fading light. I listened to the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street and thought about something I had never considered before. Maybe the reason Rachel seemed surprised by my withdrawal was because it was the first time I had truly stepped out of a role she had come to expect. For 19 years, I had been the person who closed every gap, the person who repaired every disconnect, the person who carried every awkward silence until it disappeared. Now those silences remained exactly where they were. And for the first time, Rachel had to decide whether she wanted to cross the distance herself. The experiment continued without a single announcement. That was the part that fascinated me most. I never told Rachel I was changing. I never sat her down and explained some grand plan. I simply stopped doing what I had always done. And little by little, the results began revealing themselves. November arrived with colder mornings and shorter days. The trees throughout our neighborhood had nearly emptied their branches, leaving thin silhouettes against gray skies. One Saturday, I woke up earlier than usual and decided to drive to a state park about 30 miles away. Years earlier, I used to spend entire weekends exploring trails, but somewhere along the way that part of my life disappeared beneath responsibilities, routines, and the endless effort of maintaining a marriage that seemed to need constant attention. I poured coffee into a travel mug, grabbed a jacket, and headed toward the front door. As I reached for my keys, Rachel looked up from the couch. "Where are you going?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unusual, because it had been a long time since she seemed interested. "Just going hiking for a few hours," I said. She lowered her phone slightly. "Since when?" I almost laughed. "Since before we got married." Rachel stared at me for a second before nodding. Oh, that was the entire conversation. Yet I thought about it during the entire drive. The truth was simple. She had forgotten pieces of who I was. Maybe because I had forgotten them too. The trail wound through rolling hills covered in fallen leaves. Cool air filled my lungs as I walked beneath tall trees that stretched toward a pale blue sky. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt peaceful. There was no pressure to fix anything. No pressure to create connection. No pressure to manage someone else's feelings. Just silence, fresh air, and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. Looking back, that morning marked an important shift. I stopped viewing my life as something that existed around my marriage. I started remembering that it existed alongside it. What happened next surprised me. Over the following weeks, I found more opportunities to reconnect with parts of myself I had neglected. I started going to the gym again 3 evenings a week. I met an old friend named Brian for lunch after not seeing him in nearly 2 years. I spent Saturday mornings reading instead of sitting around waiting to see whether Rachel wanted to do something. None of these changes were dramatic. Yet together they created a feeling I had not experienced in a very long time. Momentum. One Thursday evening, I came home carrying a gym bag and found Rachel in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of roasted vegetables filled the room. Soft music played from a speaker on the counter. As I set my bag down, she glanced at it. "You have been going a lot lately," she said. "To the gym?" I asked. She nodded. "Yeah." I shrugged. "Feels good to get back into it." Rachel studied me for a moment. There was something thoughtful in her expression, something I could not quite identify. "You seem different," she said quietly. Years earlier, I would have immediately asked what she meant. I would have turned the comment into a 20-minute conversation. This time I simply smiled. "Maybe." The uncertainty on her face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. For the first time in a very long time, she did not seem entirely sure what I was thinking. Later that night, I sat alone in the den while wind rattled tree branches outside the windows. The room felt warm and comfortable. A lamp cast soft light across a shelf filled with family photographs. Looking at those pictures, I realized something important. I had spent years believing that love meant constantly proving your devotion. Constantly reaching, constantly giving, constantly sacrificing. But maybe healthy love required something else too. Maybe it required maintaining your own identity. Maybe it required remembering who you were before you became responsible for everyone else. And as the wind continued moving through the darkness outside, I had the distinct feeling that Rachel was beginning to notice a version of me she had not seen in years. The question was whether she would understand why he had returned. By the time Thanksgiving approached, something unexpected had happened. The silence that once felt uncomfortable had started feeling peaceful. That realization caught me off guard because I had spent years believing that happiness inside a marriage depended on constant interaction, constant communication, constant reassurance. Yet the more I focused on rebuilding my own life, the less anxious I felt about what Rachel was doing. For the first time in a very long while, my days no longer revolved around trying to create connection that seemed unwilling to happen naturally. Instead, I was busy living. One Saturday morning, I met Brian and a few other friends for breakfast at a small diner outside town. The place had been there for decades. Red vinyl booths, the smell of coffee and pancakes, local farmers talking about weather forecasts near the counter. Simple things, familiar things. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about careers, family, travel plans, and everything else that tends to fill conversations between men approaching 50. What surprised me was how energized I felt afterward. Looking back, I realized how isolated I had quietly become. Not because Rachel demanded it, because I had gradually stopped investing in other parts of my life. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that being a devoted husband meant narrowing my world until almost everything existed inside the boundaries of my marriage. The problem was that when that marriage became emotionally unbalanced, my entire world became unbalanced too. What happened next surprised me even more. Later that afternoon, I returned home carrying a takeout coffee. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen island reading something on her tablet. She looked up almost immediately. "How was breakfast?" she asked. I paused. Questions like that were becoming more common. Not dramatically more common, just enough to notice. "It was good," I said. "We stayed longer than I expected." She nodded. "Who was there?" There was genuine curiosity in her voice, the kind that had been missing for years. I told her about the group, and for a few minutes we talked casually. Nothing emotional, nothing heavy. Yet the conversation flowed more naturally than many we had shared over the previous several years. Afterward, I found myself thinking about an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Rachel had never expected me to actually stop chasing her. Maybe she believed I would continue doing what I had always done. Continue reaching. Continue initiating. Continue carrying the emotional weight of the relationship regardless of how little effort came back in return. The more I considered that possibility, the more it explained her recent behavior. One evening a week later, I was sitting in the den researching hiking trails for an upcoming weekend trip when Rachel appeared in the doorway. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked. "Saturday morning," I said. "There is a trail about an hour north that I want to check out." She remained standing there for a second. "By yourself?" I nodded. Rachel looked thoughtful. "You have been doing that a lot lately." The comment was neutral, but I sensed something beneath it. Not criticism, not disapproval. Something closer to uncertainty. I enjoy it, I replied. She slowly nodded. Then she asked a question that stayed with me for days. Why did you stop before? For a moment, I did not know how to answer. The honest response felt too complicated. Because I got busy trying to keep our marriage together. Because I slowly abandoned parts of myself without noticing. Because somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was allowed to have a life outside of being someone's husband. Instead, I simply smiled and said, I guess I forgot how much I missed it. Rachel looked away for a second. That makes sense. Later that night, while sitting alone in the living room, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. The irony was impossible to ignore. The less I focused on getting Rachel's attention, the more attention she seemed to give. The less I chased connection, the more naturally it appeared. It was not a complete transformation. We were not suddenly closer. We were not having deep conversations every night. But the dynamic was shifting. Slowly, quietly, naturally. And for the first time since that rainy evening in October, I began to understand something important. Rachel was not reacting to my absence. She was reacting to my presence returning somewhere else. The energy that once flowed entirely toward her was now being invested in my own life. My health, my friendships, my interests, my happiness. And as winter approached and the days grew shorter, I had the unmistakable feeling that Rachel was beginning to realize she had not simply asked me to stop chasing her. She had accidentally given me permission to find myself again. What I finally understood as December settled in was that Rachel was not missing the man I used to be as much as she was missing the certainty that came with him. That realization arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No emotional confrontation. Just a quiet moment that revealed more than any conversation could. I had come home from work, changed clothes, and was preparing to leave for the gym when Rachel walked into the kitchen. Outside, early winter darkness had already covered the neighborhood. The windows reflected the warm light from inside the house. You were going out again? She asked. Her tone was casual, but something about it caught my attention. I nodded. Just for an hour. She leaned against the counter. Seems like you are always busy lately. Looking back, that comment marked an important turning point. A few months earlier, Rachel rarely noticed how I spent my time. Now she was paying attention, not because I had demanded it, because my life no longer revolved entirely around her. I guess I have been, I replied. She nodded slowly and looked down at her coffee mug. For a second, it seemed like she wanted to say something else. Then she simply said, have fun, and walked away. The interaction lasted less than a minute, yet it stayed with me throughout my workout. What happened next surprised me. The more independent I became emotionally, the more clearly I could see the dynamic that had existed between us for years. Rachel had become accustomed to being the center of my attention, not because she was cruel, not because she intentionally demanded it, because I had willingly built my life around providing it. Every time I canceled my own plans, every time I abandoned a hobby, every time I adjusted my priorities to accommodate hers, I quietly reinforced the same message. My life comes second. Yours comes first. Over time, that message became normal for both of us. One Saturday afternoon, I was organizing some old boxes in the garage when I found a photo album from nearly 15 years earlier. Curious, I carried it into the house and sat at the dining room table. The pages were filled with photographs from camping trips, road trips, family gatherings, and weekend adventures. Younger versions of Rachel and me smiled back from every page. A few minutes later, Rachel walked into the room and noticed the album. I have not seen that in years, she said. She pulled out a chair and sat beside me. Together we turned pages in silence. Then she pointed at a picture from a hiking trip in the Smoky Mountains. You love doing things like that, she said. I smiled. I still do. Rachel stared at the photograph longer than expected. I guess I forgot. Her words were quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the refrigerator. But I heard them. More importantly, I believed her. For years, I assumed Rachel stopped noticing who I was because she no longer cared. Now I was beginning to understand a different possibility. Maybe she stopped noticing because I slowly stopped showing her. I had hidden parts of myself beneath responsibilities and routines until even I forgot they existed. That realization changed something inside me. Instead of feeling resentful, I felt strangely calm. The truth was that neither of us had arrived here overnight. We had built this dynamic together. The difference was that I was finally doing something about it. A few days before Christmas, Rachel asked me a question that lingered in my mind long afterward. We were sitting in the living room while snow drifted softly outside. Holiday lights cast colorful reflections across the windows. Out of nowhere, she looked at me and asked, "Are you happier now?" For a moment, I did not answer. Not because I was avoiding the question, because I was genuinely thinking about it. Then I nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Rachel looked away and stared at the Christmas tree for several seconds. There was no anger in her expression, no disappointment, just reflection. And in that moment, I realized something important. Rachel was beginning to understand that she had not lost control of me. She was witnessing something far more unfamiliar. She was watching a man remember his own value. And for the first time, I had the feeling that she was not entirely sure what that meant for either of us. By the middle of January, the changes were no longer visible only to me. Other people were starting to notice them too. The strange thing was that nobody could have pointed to a dramatic event that explained it. There had been no separation, no major argument, no life-altering announcement. Yet something about me was different, and the people around us seemed to sense it. The clearest example came during a neighborhood gathering hosted by one of our friends on a Saturday evening. It was the kind of winter event that happened every year. Good food, comfortable conversation, football playing quietly on a television in the background, groups of neighbors discussing work, travel plans, and the unusually cold weather. For years, I attended these gatherings almost automatically. I would spend most of the evening checking whether Rachel was having a good time, making sure she was comfortable, and adjusting my own experience around hers. That night felt different from the moment we arrived. Within minutes, several people approached me to ask about hiking trails, weekend trips, and some of the fitness goals I had mentioned during recent conversations. One neighbor wanted recommendations for local parks. Another wanted advice about getting back into shape after years away from exercise. Before long, I found myself laughing, telling stories, and genuinely enjoying the evening. What surprised me was not that people were talking to me. It was how natural everything felt. I was not performing. I was not seeking approval. I was simply being myself. At one point, I happened to glance across the room and noticed Rachel watching me. She was standing near the kitchen island holding a glass of sparkling water while talking with a small group of friends. Yet every few minutes her attention drifted back in my direction. The expression on her face was difficult to read. It was not annoyance. It was not jealousy. If anything, it looked like confusion mixed with curiosity, as though she was seeing a version of me she had not encountered in years. What happened next stayed with me long after the evening ended. One of our neighbors laughed and said, "Grant, every time I see you lately, you are heading somewhere. Hiking, meeting friends, going to the gym. You are busier than any of us." Everyone smiled. Before I could answer, Rachel spoke from across the room. "That is true. I never know where he is anymore." The comment sounded playful, and most people treated it that way. They laughed politely and moved on. But I noticed something. Rachel did not laugh. She simply looked down for a second before taking a sip from her glass. Years earlier, I would have immediately reassured her. I would have explained my schedule. I would have made sure she felt comfortable. This time I simply smiled and continued the conversation. The evening moved forward, but something had shifted. On the drive home, snow flurries drifted beneath streetlights while the heater hummed softly inside the truck. Rachel stared out the passenger window longer than usual. Finally, she spoke. "People seem to like talking to you." I glanced over briefly. "I like talking to them too." She nodded. Several seconds passed. Then she said something unexpected. "You seem more confident lately." Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. I considered the comment carefully before answering. Maybe I just stopped doubting myself. Rachel looked out the window again. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. Back at home, I hung my coat near the front door and headed toward the kitchen for a glass of water. A few minutes later, Rachel appeared beside me. She leaned against the counter and folded her arms. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." She hesitated. For a moment, it looked like she was choosing her words very carefully. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Not because of what she asked, because of how sincerely she asked it. I thought about my answer for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Rachel looked down at the floor. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then she quietly said, "I do not remember the last time you said that." She turned and walked toward the hallway before I could respond. As I stood there listening to her footsteps disappear upstairs, I realized something important. Rachel was beginning to understand that the man she once expected to remain exactly where she left him had continued growing without her permission. And for the first time since that rainy evening in October, she seemed genuinely unsure of what would happen next. The conversation finally happened on a cold Sunday evening near the end of January. Outside, fresh snow covered the neighborhood in a smooth layer of white that reflected the glow of streetlights. Inside, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the furnace. I was sitting in the den reading a book when I heard Rachel's footsteps approaching. There was something different about them. Slower, more deliberate. A few seconds later, she appeared in the doorway. For a moment, she simply stood there. Then she asked a question that immediately told me this was not an ordinary conversation. "Do you have a minute?" I closed the book and set it aside. Of course. Rachel walked into the room and sat down across from me. The silence that followed felt unusually heavy. Not uncomfortable. Important. For months we had been moving around the same issue without addressing it directly. Now it seemed we had finally arrived at the moment neither of us could avoid. Rachel folded her hands together and looked down briefly before speaking. "I feel like we are drifting apart." The words hung in the air between us. Looking back, what surprised me most was my reaction. A year earlier, hearing those words would have filled me with urgency. I would have immediately started searching for solutions. I would have asked questions, offered reassurance, and taken responsibility for fixing whatever was wrong. This time I simply listened. Not because I did not care, because I had already spent months thinking about the distance she was only beginning to notice. Rachel looked up. "Do you feel it too?" I nodded. "Yes." For a moment she seemed relieved. Then another silence settled over the room. Snow drifted past the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator quietly hummed. Ordinary sounds. Yet everything felt unusually clear. "You barely talk to me anymore," Rachel finally said. The statement was not angry. It sounded more confused than anything else. I considered her words carefully before answering. "I talk when there is something to say." She frowned slightly. "That is not how it used to be." There it was. The sentence that revealed more than she probably intended. Not how it used to be. She was right. It was not. I used to carry every conversation. I used to fill every silence. I used to make sure connection happened even when it required effort from only one side. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "You have changed, Grant." Her voice was quiet. "You used to try harder." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I found myself looking toward the window where snow continued falling through the darkness. Then I asked a question. "Do you remember what you told me back in October?" The change in her expression was immediate. She knew exactly what I meant. Rachel looked away first. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "You told me you wanted to decide when we talked. When we spent time together. You told me to stop chasing you." The room became very still. Several seconds passed before she responded. "I remember." Her voice was softer now, almost uncertain. I leaned back in my chair. So I listened. Rachel stared at the floor. What happened next surprised me more than anything else that evening. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Instead, she quietly said, "I did not think you actually would." The honesty of that answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. Rachel never expected the dynamic to change. She expected me to keep doing what I had always done. Keep reaching. Keep pursuing. Keep making sure the relationship moved forward regardless of how much effort came from her side. But when I stopped, she was forced to experience the same distance I had been living with for years. Rachel looked up, and for the first time I saw genuine regret in her eyes. "I think I took a lot of things for granted," she admitted. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I let the silence remain. Not as punishment, as truth. Eventually I nodded. Maybe we both did. She looked confused. I continued. "You took my effort for granted. And I took my own value for granted." Rachel said nothing. Yet I could tell she was listening carefully. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. No raised voices. No dramatic revelations. Just honesty. The kind that only appears when people stop protecting themselves from uncomfortable truths. And as the evening came to an end, I realized something important. This was not the moment our problems disappeared. It was the moment they were finally acknowledged. For the first time in a very long time, Rachel was no longer talking about controlling the distance between us. She was confronting the reality of it. And as I watched snow continue falling beyond the windows, I had the unmistakable feeling that both of our lives were about to move in a direction neither of us had expected. The conversation did not magically solve everything. Real life rarely works that way. The weeks that followed were not defined by dramatic speeches or sudden transformations. Instead, they were defined by something much more meaningful: consistency. February slowly gave way to March. The snow began to disappear from sidewalks. Small patches of green returned to lawns throughout the neighborhood. The air felt lighter. And for the first time in years, so did our marriage. What surprised me most was not that Rachel changed. It was how change actually happened. Not through pressure, not through arguments, not through endless discussions about what was wrong. It happened because both of us finally stopped pretending. Rachel stopped pretending that emotional distance had no consequences. I stopped pretending that carrying an entire relationship by myself was an act of love. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Rachel sitting at the island with 2 cups of coffee already prepared. Years earlier, that would have seemed completely ordinary. Yet standing there that morning, I immediately recognized the significance. She had thought about me before I entered the room. She had made space for me without being asked. It was a small gesture, but meaningful relationships are often rebuilt through small gestures rather than grand moments. We carried our coffee onto the back patio and sat quietly beneath a pale spring sky. Birds moved between the trees behind our fence. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. The neighborhood felt alive again after months of winter. Rachel stared into her cup before speaking. I spent a long time believing you would always be there no matter what. I nodded slowly. There was no anger left in me, only understanding. I know. She looked up. I do not think I appreciated that enough. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said something that had taken me months to learn. I spent a long time believing that if I just tried harder, everything would eventually work. Rachel smiled sadly. We were both wrong. The truth of that statement settled gently between us. We were both wrong. Not because either of us was a bad person. Because relationships can slowly drift into unhealthy patterns when nobody stops to question them. Looking back, I realized the most important thing I gained was not a stronger marriage. It was a stronger sense of self. If Rachel had never changed, that lesson still would have mattered. If the outcome had been completely different, that lesson still would have mattered. Because my happiness could not continue depending entirely on whether someone else chose to value me. It had to begin with valuing myself. As spring continued unfolding around us, life felt different. Not perfect. Real life never is. But balanced, honest, healthy in ways it had not been for a very long time. One evening, several months after everything began, Rachel and I took a walk through the neighborhood just as the sun was setting. Golden lights stretched across the street. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Families sat on porches enjoying the warmer weather. At one point, Rachel reached for my hand. The gesture was simple, natural, unforced, and somehow that made it more meaningful than anything else. Because this time, neither of us was chasing. Neither of us was withdrawing. We were simply walking in the same direction. When I think about everything that happened, one lesson stands above all the others. Love should never require you to disappear. The moment you abandon your identity in order to preserve a relationship, you begin creating a version of yourself that neither person can truly appreciate. The healthiest relationships are not built when one person gives everything and the other receives it. They are built when 2 complete people choose each other again and again without losing themselves in the process. And now I would genuinely love to know what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have made the same decision? Do you believe Rachel truly changed, or do you think she simply learned a difficult lesson about taking someone for granted? Every viewer sees a story like this differently. And if stories about relationships, self-respect, growth, and real-life emotional lessons resonate with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss future journeys like this one. Sometimes the quietest changes end up teaching us the biggest lessons.